Right, I think I'm going to kick off. My name is Nick Robbins. I'm a professor in practice for sustainable finance at the LSE's Grantham Research Institute. It's my delight to welcome you to the launch of the new report, Making Transition Plans Just, how to embed the just transition into financial sector net zero plans. We're clearly in a time of crisis, and we need to scale up finance for climate action by multiples of current levels, and do this in ways that responds to the intersecting shocks of war, food and energy inflation, and rising inequality. So it's particularly important, I think, to launch this new report, Making Transition Plans Just. This is a work of many hands, and I'd first like to thank the co-authors of the report, Curran, Sabrina Muller, Aditya Subramani, and Safar Tekel and myself. This report is also a product of the Financing the Just Transition Alliance, what we like to call FAHITA. And I'd like to thank the many alliance members and others from banks and investors, civil society, trade unions, and universities who've contributed their insights. And I'd also like to thank our partners who supported this work, Friends Provident Foundation, the Candriam Institute for Sustainable Development, 30 Percy, and the Grantham Foundation. We know that to meet net zero goals on time, we need credible plans from governments, from business, and from finance. And to be successful, these plans need to incorporate just transition principles. The Making the Just Transition Plans Just report focuses on how banks and investors can make sure that people, notably workers, communities, and also consumers, are at the heart of the design and delivery of financial institution net zero plans. In terms of the programme for today, I'm joined by my colleague Brendan Curran, Policy Fellow at GRI and lead author of the report, who will make a short presentation of the highlights. I'm also delighted this will be followed by an excellent panel. We have Sharan Burrow, General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation, Tony Rook, Executive Director at the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, Paddy Arbour, who's Head of International Government Engagement at Aviva Investors, and then Andrea Saldarriaga, who is Director Social and Environmental Policy at Barclays. We'll have a panel discussion, but you will also have your opportunity to ask the panel questions. Please put these in the Q&A, and these can be upvoted, and I'll try and take as many of these as possible. Without further ado, I'd now like to hand over to you, Brendan, to give us some highlights from the new report. Many thanks.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to now try and do the tricky part, which is share my screen, and hopefully that should be fine. Which I think it is. So yes, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today at the launch of this report. So yeah, we've been working on this over the last few months and really interested to hear feedback from all the contributors and everyone who joins us here today. So in summary, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the report. I really only have 10 minutes as we really want to get into discussion with our fantastic panel. But I wanted to give a quick overview, but I do encourage you to really read the full report, which gives a lot more detail in terms of the specifics of what needs to be done in terms of embedding the just transition within net zero transition plans. So as Nick touched upon, I think the drive to net zero has to be driven through a consideration of the social and social implications, i.e. a just transition. And through a lot of our literature at the LSE, we've highlighted that it is the right thing to do a just transition in the sense that it takes consideration of social justice. It is necessary to get people's buy-in to the net zero transition and get that political capital that's needed to drive the momentum behind that transition. And it's also the smart thing to do in terms of preparing the right human and social capital that we need to transition to a low carbon economy. So in this report, we've really tried to guide financial institutions on several key just transition factors that they should be embedding in their design of their net zero transition plans. That is considering the social risks, as well as the social opportunities, and embedding a consideration of meaningful participation and social dialogue. We have Tony Rook here from GFANZ, and we have really been using their framework of 5 themes for what constitutes a credible plan, and we'll go through that in more detail. But as you'll see in the report and in this presentation, there is action already within the financial sector to take consideration of the just transition. Now is the moment, I guess, to use this report and other work to scale that up and make it more commonplace. So there is a need for for a just transition, as that will put people at the heart of a transition to a resilient net zero economy. And really, if it's managed well, we can have significant socioeconomic benefits in the form of more and better quality jobs, as shown by the diagram on the right here, in terms of the kind of net benefit of jobs in the energy transition. But also, if it's managed poorly, there is the risk that we could have stranded assets in the financial system, stranded workers, communities, or even countries. And this could result in the inefficient delivery of a transition to a low carbon economy or non-delivery. And we really think that while policymakers have an imperative to set the policy framework for what's needed, business and financial institutions can take action now on the just transition. Moving on to our guidance in terms of net zero transition plans. So we have always said that there is existing frameworks that institutions and businesses can lean on in terms of principles, particularly with the UN ILO's just transition principles, as well as other established standards and goals. But we've really tried to suggest that through the report, institutions can be thinking about three key just transition factors, as I've said already, which is one, anticipating, assessing, and addressing the social risks of the transition, identifying, enabling social opportunities, and ensuring that meaningful dialogue and participation is key to any transition plans. And really these three factors need to be embedded and considered through both the sectoral and geographic specifics that are needed and vary in terms of a just transition. And for those that might be familiar for work, we generally think about the impact of the just transition through these four impacted groups. And really that should be central to the design of any net zero transition plans also. Workers obviously being central in terms of anticipating employment shifts and ensuring social protections, but also with suppliers and spillover effects in the communities who are reliant on fossil fuel production. And very pertinently right now, as we're seeing with the energy crisis in many parts of the world, how can we ensure that consumers aren't ladled with the cost to a transition as well? So our report, as I've said, uses the GFANS framework, as you can see by this diagram on the right, in terms of foundations, implementation, and engagement strategy, as well as suggesting metrics and targets and how you can embed it within their governance. We have done this in the sense to ensure that there is consistent approaches for financial institutions, and that I think will result in more efficient and more widespread adoption of the framework and the recommendations of this report, hopefully. Yes, and so the first theme is on foundations, where financial institutions should be considering how to embed the just transition factors that I've laid out, but really embedding that within the goals, ambitions, and foundations of their net zero plans, and particularly within their targets. So we think it's really part of strategic risk management analysis and prudent planning to be assessing those social risks of your net zero transition plan and embedding that consideration by sector, specific sectors, as well as different geographies. Within the report, we break down recommendations on the kind of implementation strategy, that is internal policies, as well as product design and other aspects, by banks in terms of our recommendation to banks, and as well as investors. With financial institutions more generally, we suggest there should be an assessment, our social assessment, our social analysis of net zero transition plans. And this should also be looking at high priority sectors and activities such as coal, oil, gas, and deforestation. But specific to banks, we recommend and go into detail about how they can respond to each of the different client groups that they deal with: retail, corporates, small and medium enterprises, as well as capital markets. And not only driving ambition or innovation, in terms of just transition aligned products, but also reviewing existing product offerings and embedding that within their design. With investors, we take a similar approach, but trying to get them to review the consideration of a just transition across each stage of the investment process, from screening and due diligence all the way through to how they allocate their capital. And within the report, we go into detail around each of the different asset classes and how that can take consideration of a just transition. We give, as I've said, we go into different examples in different parts of the report. And here, as you can see on this slide, we give an example from Introductory Asset Management, who are developing a sustainable equity product where they use their own investment philosophy framework that looks at how management are identifying the need for a transition, their willingness, I guess, and the actual ability. They assess the feasibility of the company transition away from fossil fuels. So in the engagement strategy for, again, those that have followed the work of Nick and the LSE will know that we have did some work last year in a report called From the Grand to the Granular, which looked at investor expectations of a just transition. And we worked with Royal London Asset Management and Friends Provident Foundation to implement those. Within the corporate engagement section, we leverage a lot of our experience and research from that to give concrete examples for investors, but also for banks in terms of how they can deal with their corporate clients. And as we've always said, from a government point of view, the need for the delivery of a just transition requires a set of policies and a policy framework that businesses and investors can respond to. But there is an onus there is an onus on investors to highlight and advocate the government where they feel there's inefficient or insufficient policy. And as you can see, Aviva, and we're delighted to have Paddy here today, have already outlined that policy advocacy point in their climate strategy that was published earlier this year. And finally, on engagement, we touch on industry engagement as well as stakeholder engagement, particularly involving trade unions and civil society where possible. And we have quite a strong example where Rabobank collaborated with ASC and WWF to design a green loan in Chile. And finally, the challenging part of this, and really the part where there's emerging practice, is around metrics and targets. Now, there is only emerging convergence, I guess, on what constitutes best practice in terms of metrics and measuring both how institutions can progress against their own net zero targets with a just transition lens, but also what can they measure in terms of outcomes, in terms of and how can they measure outcomes to a just transition. So we do suggest some metrics, but I think this is an area where we can, in terms of next steps, we can do a lot more. And of course, we have recommendations on how to embed this at a board level, as well as within skills and culture. So before I hand back to our panel, I just wanted to highlight within the report we set out, we're not really finished here. This is really an attempt to embed consideration of the just transition within the first iteration of gold standard net zero transition plans. And really over the next 12 months, as we see more and more of these come to market and be published, we want to be reviewing how financial institutions have embedded the just transition within their plans, trying to think about innovation in terms of how they can allocate their capital. I did a piece earlier this year in terms of a just transition bond through an anchor institution in Northern Ireland. Can we do that in other geographies, in other sectors? And of course, strengthening policy frameworks. And hopefully that will result in the situation where we're seeing much more mainstreaming of this and adoption of considerations of the just transition across the whole financial sector. So I think hopefully that gives everyone a little bit of a flavour, but I'm going to stop sharing there and hand back to Nick and the panel.
Thank you so much, Brendan, and take a breath. That was a very rapid review. We'll post the slides after the meeting, and obviously the report is already online. And now I'd like to turn to our panel. And if I could turn to you first, Sharan, clearly yourself and the ITUC has been really championing the just transition for decades now. Why is it so important for you and your members to get just transition principles into net zero plans by business, but also we're talking here about the financial sector? Sharan, over to you.
So Nick, thank you very much and congratulations on the report. There is no doubt that if we want to make this transition to the scale and at the speed that it requires us to deal with what is an existential crisis to humanity itself, not just to our business model, but indeed to people and their lands and their properties and their livelihoods, then we have to give them confidence the transition will include them. It's a simple message that if you actually make people frightened of a transition of any kind, change of any kind, then the fear builds to resistance and it builds then to opposition and often social unrest. We're unfortunately seeing a lot of that. And if you consider that in our coal sector, which was the first sector that people realised had to, in fact, virtually disappear, we have to exit from coal, we've done it in some jurisdictions, then these are communities built by this industry. You walk the areas around Leon in Spain, for example, And you will see that some 80 or 90 years ago, in fact, there was a fight to embed coal in pristine agricultural land, but it built thriving communities. And now the fear is the opposite, that what will be left for them. I can tell you hundreds of these stories, but then there's a positive side as well, because while we have to look at what the future is for those communities, and they ought to be at the table on the design team, the workers in their workplace, and indeed the communities, then we also know that as we seek to invest in development plans for those industries, then there are good news stories. For renewable energy, for every 10 jobs in renewable energy, there's 5 to 10 in the manufacturing industries, there's transport and logistics and other areas of the ecosystem that, if they're good jobs, add up to 30 to 35 in the broader community or communities in the supply chains, whether domestically or internationally. That's how you build communities. But if we don't have the leverage from the beginning of the investment cycle, the investors themselves, and remember, you know, pension funds make up about $45 trillion of investment in the global economy, our workers' capital. So if we're not investing in climate justice, with a just future, with jobs, good jobs, and sustainable communities, then we're really silly in terms of the designs we're putting in place, because you lose not just confidence, but opportunity, and you draw resistance we don't otherwise need. So Brendan said it all. The leverage of the financial investors is enormous, but they have to be serious about assessing the risk, asking people to the table, and making sure that it's not just at the beginning of the investment, but through the life cycle.
Many thanks. Very, very clear. I think that's, yeah, losing confidence and missing opportunity. Very, very clear. Tony, if I can turn to you at GFANZ, a major initiative bringing together hundreds of financial institutions committed to net zero. It'd be really good to hear from you how you see just transition fitting in the frameworks you're applying. I know you've been doing this for so-called real economy companies, but also in the financial sector. So where does this resonate and make sense for the work you're doing?
Thanks, Nick. And just to reiterate what Brendan and Sharan have said, it's absolutely vital that we have a transition that is just as well. And I think Brendan said a really key word from a financial institution point of view, an efficient use of capital. Efficient use of capital means the economy is working and is working in the right way. This is an opportunity, I would say, for also financial services to be able to create something that everybody can be not only proud of, but also have an opportunity to contribute to the 21st century economy and net zero economy. And that efficiency means it's less disruptive, as Sharan was talking about. It's cheaper. It means that we can afford to build in more resiliency, because the world already has some climate change baked in that we will need to be resilient to. We can get higher returns in the economy, which means we can have more successful economic growth. And therefore, it'd be more holistically across those 4 key groups that the work you have authored has identified. They can be each more successful through that efficient use. So at GFANZ, where we see it actually, we believe that the transition needs to be just, and that we have a number of areas that we're working on for real key financing strategies for transition finance. And those are scaling climate solutions. And Sharan said they're an economic opportunity and a job creation opportunity there. They have the potential to bring disadvantaged workers, communities, and already marginalized social groups back into the economy better, and can positively create opportunity, which in turn means the economy is working more successfully. There's more opportunity for financial institutions and better returns as well. So it is a positive cycle. We have introduced this into the net zero transition plans that you talked about, both principally for the financial institutions, and we introduce it in the core foundation component. What is the objective and priority, and how are you including just transition into those considerations as a business objective, so that then it sprinkles through the implementation within the business products and services, as Brendan talked about, but also engagement with clients and portfolio companies, with industry, and with governments, and becomes something that is then a part of the a measure of success in driving the net zero transition for a financial institution. And all of this needs data, and data on just transition principally would come from real economy companies that are at the cutting edge of creating those business activities. So we need information from there. We have sprinkled it throughout. But what I would say is that we've not been creating anything new here. We've been heavily referencing your work here at the Grantham Institute, as well as others as well that have been working on this, like the World Benchmarking Alliance as well. So our job is to really sort of help bring that and amplify that across the financial institutions and say, you may need to consider this in your just transition as part of your net zero transition plan.
Thanks, Tony. Really, really useful frameworks. And I was particularly struck by how you were talking about the place of just transition in that foundational segment for a really effective net zero plan, and sort of just transition as a business objective, and then that cascading through. Really, really good. Paddy, if I could turn to you from Aviva Investors, Brendan did point to your work. You're, I think, one of the sort of front runners in terms of net zero plans. Still, we're expecting more and more of these to come through in the next months into 2023. It'd be really good to sort of hear how and why that was an important aspect, I think, particularly on the policy engagement side when you were putting your plan together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. And you know, first of all, just to add congratulations on the report. I think it's genuinely really helpful, and I think it'll have, as Tony was saying, an immediate impact in terms of contributing to some of those frameworks that are being developed at the moment for the transition plan. So congratulations on that. You know, great question to kick off with. Why do we at Aviva champion the just transition? I think if I have to boil it right down, is for two reasons. So because it's right, and because it's practical. And I think it was actually quite similar to how Brendan kicked off one of his slides. So it feels sort of self-evidently right that if we're making this transition and we're using our influence with government, with companies to push for the transition, it needs to be a fair and an equitable transition. And that aligns with our kind of, you know, our corporate values and how we try to act as an agent in the world. You know, it aligns with what I think personally. You know, I've sort of told you this before, Nick, but I grew up in the north of England in the 1980s when pretty much all of our major industries were being transitioned, not voluntarily, you know, manufacturing, you know, mining. And that was an incredibly painful time for that region. And we've barely recovered from it now, 35 years later. And it was a transition that was really unplanned, and even where it was planned, it was not planned with the intention of looking after those communities that were being left behind. So, and you know, and that is just one region in the UK. That story has been repeated throughout the world, time and time again. So we know that planning these transitions is essential, and that planning them in a just way is the right thing to do. But then it comes to my second point, it's also the practical thing to do. And I think this very much picks up on some of the comments that Sharan was making, that ultimately the way in which this transition is going to happen is for governments to shape the right policy frameworks to incentivize businesses and individuals to act in a way that get us on the track to net zero. But we know that governments will only act if they feel like they have the support of people. people who lose out in any kind of economic change often are always, in fact, shout louder than the people who stand to gain, understandably. And so therefore, if governments are going to feel like they have popular support to make the kind of, potentially quite difficult changes to policy that are necessary to see the net zero transition through, they have to look after those people who stand to lose out. It's just common sense. It's absolutely practical. And so from an investor perspective, how are we using our influence to get that point across, both to governments who listen to us because they want to see our capital flow into their economies, and to the corporates in which we invest, many of whom will have to be considering this kind of transition in terms of their operations, and need to be doing so, probably at a swifter pace than is currently the case. So yeah, in a nutshell, we absolutely support the just transition because it's the right thing to do, but it's the practical thing to do as well.
Lovely. And Andrea, if I could come to you from Barclays, it'd be really good to get your sense. We've heard from an investor, Tony, from the sort of broader financial sector, but really sort of the rationale for how you're considering this as part of your net zero efforts.
So first of all, thank you, Nick and Brendan and all the team. It's been a pleasure to be involved in contributing to the report, and an important learning process for me and for the team in Barclays that was involved in that. So, and I mean, I think that Tony and Patrick have already made the case and highlighted very important points about the understanding that for the transition to succeed, it needs to account for the social impacts on people and communities. And this is also our understanding. And Barclays recognizes the role that financial institutions play in integrating these considerations into the policies and decision-making as part of the participation in the transition. I think that where the key question comes for us is really on how to do this. And in particular, when you have a global institution that serves all sectors, all geographies, and a diversity of clients that includes households, SMEs, sovereign governments, and big corporate clients. And I think that this is where the report is very useful, because it is actually focused on how we can go about the integration of these social considerations of climate action. And there are many elements, many valuable elements in the report, in particular the very useful way that the recommendations are mapped to the critical elements of defense for the credible transition plans. But I'd like to highlight one of the key aspects of the report, and I think it's these key factors or elements in the just transitions that are outlined in the report. Because while we do not have yet a single definition of just transition, and the notion of what is just is going to be different for different people, is going to be different in different geographies, I believe it is useful that we try to get consensus around these key steps, these key elements or actions that would make that a new financial product, a transition plan, or a policy intervention from government is considered or defined as just transition. And I think the useful thing also in this proposal is that it relies on the existing normative frameworks, so we are not reinventing the wheel, and is already aligned also with the agendas that exist within corporates. So let me, to try to explain what it means. And if you remember the 3 steps that you mentioned, Brandon, so the first one is around identifying and addressing the social risk to the transition. And this is the risk to people, right? Identifying the adverse impacts on people. And for that, we have already existing frameworks, right? The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights that were mirrored in the OECD guidelines. The ILO core labor standards, you have already a framework that is actually geared towards understanding those impacts on people and communities, right? And they are already part of what companies, corporates and financial institutions are doing as part of their, work in managing risk. The second point, identifying and enable the social opportunities, a key one. It is going beyond the risk aspect and also looking at the just transition is about opportunities. And we have also frameworks like the SDGs, again, frameworks that the companies are already using. So how can we define if something is a social contribution? So let's see if which of the goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, are we meeting with the action, the intervention, or the financial product. And the last one, which is key, is more of the procedural side, right? So is how do we ensure that effective dialogue, that effective participation of those who are going to be impacted, is actually also embedded in these in the actions and the production of the plans. And there are also already frameworks for that, like the Aarhus Convention on Environmental Justice and other kind of frameworks. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I think that having a consensus on these straightforward 3-element frameworks can help us, as financial institutions and in general, as corporates, to kind of move forward and get real to concrete action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think that's really powerful that we're not necessarily inventing things here. This is Just Transition is about applying existing frameworks, ILO standards, UN guiding principles, OECD multinational enterprise guidelines, the SDGs themselves in this transformation we're talking about here. So I think that's really, really, really important. Thanks to all of you who are starting to put in the questions. We have a number there. I'd like to, in the next rounds, we've heard a lot about the why, and I think the business case for doing this. I think maybe sort of looking a little bit more granularly at some of the particular examples. So some of the questions that are coming through, I think, particularly issues, and maybe if you sort of want to respond to this as we come through, particularly about SMEs in supply chains who fear being excluded by corporates. How can financial institutions respond to that question, which I think is key? We're largely talking, I think, so far in a sort of industrialized country context, but particularly how do we ensure that actually developing and emerging countries are not cut off from capital, and we actually support a just transition in those countries, and then there are many more. But Sharan, maybe to you, just sort of, I think you very eloquently identified the why. Are there sort of more senses of where you have a sense, particularly with the ITUC and your members, of sort of what good looks like in terms of sort of just transition planning with businesses where your members are operating?
Absolutely. Let me start from a on-the-ground example, and then what scaffolding or architecture we might need to put more of this in place. I'll give you 2 examples. The first is, of course, in the heavy industry sector, we are seeing momentum. It's not enough, Nick, but we're seeing momentum. Everybody said it was impossible to actually reduce the heat intensity of heavy industry. But if you take the cleaner steel story out of Sweden, for example, my own deputy president, having built with us and the government, with our Just Transition Centre and the government and the employer, being SSAB Steel, a dialogue. Mm-hmm. He then, when he stepped down from his position, went to work as a senior advisor for SSAB Steel until the government that's just not been re-elected stole him to be effectively an industry transition minister. But they've produced, now I've lost track of how many tons of clean steel. And the good news is that, yes, there's job displacement within the process, but there's more jobs in the hydrogen end. And so this requires then a process of negotiation around reskilling. But dialogue was at the heart of that process right from the beginning. The workers understood, the government was supportive. There weren't any actually incredibly new regulatory or subsidy frames, but the support meant that this company was ready to take a risk on a price point that wasn't quite there. And consequently, their investors are now in a lead position to spread that technology right throughout. And you're seeing Germany and many other countries follow suit. The just energy transition partnerships, which despite the pros and cons and the obstacles that are thrown at this, are critical. And last Glasgow, it was indeed the minister, the Frans Timmermans, of course, as the deputy leader of Europe, and indeed the ERB and the US, 4 of the 5 players in funding the Just Energy Transition Partnership seed fund, you'd call it, the 8.5 billion. We were all there actually championing not just the money, but the process, an impact, social impact study, voices of workers in the community, a negotiation, a joint bargaining council. These are the processes that bring together the finance, the people, and the ambition. But of course, you have to, again, be absolutely committed to the resilience of managing this through to the end. And then there's one other set of architectural pieces that we ask for, and that is that you build from the ground. We call it climate and employment proofing our workplaces. So you build from the workplace or the industry. You then map indeed the supply chains, the logistics, and you bring in the other actors so that investors can see again a whole ecosystem of, you know, what's possible. But to do this with effective government support and the mapping across industries, we're absolutely asking for just transition authorities, commissions, councils. We don't really mind what they are. But if you take Scotland, they've got a just transition, you're on it, Nick, authority, and there's a just transition minister. You know, my own country's talking about this. Canada did it for coal, and now they need to move to other areas. You're seeing it in municipalities. So what's the architecture that makes the workplace and the supply chain implications transparent, and the process to bring that together so it's logical for investors? But also don't forget, in developing economies, to answer your question, we need to provide either initial support or seed funding, and indeed de-risk mechanisms to actually enable investors to be confident that this is where they should be.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Sharan. Tony, I mean, one of the things that we touched on, we haven't gone into detail really, I think we've heard about the sort of regional dimension of this, but particularly the sectoral dimension, particularly you mentioned some of the sort of transition finance strategies. One of these is a managed phase out of high carbon sectors on the fossil fuel side, but also on deforestation. Is there more that sort of financial institutions should be thinking about in terms of just transition as they put together their plans, particularly on that sort of sectoral and maybe the managed phase out areas?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things to consider on that side of things. First and foremost is when you're actually looking at a sector, it's what climate solutions need to be put in place first. An unjust and even a disruptive transition will be if we just switch things off like that and we don't have anything to replace it. That also particularly affects certain countries that are heavily dependent on particular sectors as well. So, for example, if you're talking about managed phase out of coal in the power sector, you need to build up what will actually replace it at the same time. And you can make use of some of the same infrastructure as well there. For example, coal-fired power stations have a lot of transmission and distribution lines from them. It's much more efficient if you actually build the replacements alongside and then manage the phase down of those coal assets. And we've seen examples of this, for example, Enel in Italy that has its Future E initiative. And that's really an initiative to incorporate just transition into closing of infrastructure. And they focus on what is the impact on communities. They're focusing on power plants. They have the dialogue with the workers and the union reps. And to one of the questions there, how do you work with SMEs? Also collaborating with their suppliers. And they started it as a pilot in Italy in 2015. They've now expanded it to 40 sites. They integrate personnel through a process of reassignment to avoid knowledge loss, because they can reapply that knowledge elsewhere. And also reusing some of the divested assets, or the assets that would become divested, roads, but also the logistical components as well. And now they're rolling that out, as I said, to 40 sites at the moment. And it's not about job losses in the managed phase out necessarily. They've got, they're upskilling or reskilling half of their workforce that would be displaced by this or would potentially lose jobs. And the other half they're engaging through early retirement. So, I mean, that's just one example of a sector. And I think energy and power are probably at the forefront of that transition at the moment, but we'll see it in agriculture, we'll see it in other industries as well. And as Sharan said, there is more than enough jobs to be created from this. So it's about reskilling so that we don't actually run out of skilled labor as well to create the new transitioned infrastructure and assets that we need.
Great. Andrea, if I could turn back to you, I think in your first remarks, you were sort of saying how you operate globally, obviously with multiple different sort of business lines in terms of retail customers, corporates and SMEs and so on. Are there any particular considerations you're taking into account on this theme of emerging markets, which come up in the questions, and maybe any of the particular client groups where you're starting to explore how you translate just transition into your net zero plan? Andrea, did you hear that?
Sorry, Nick. No, so could you please say that? I'm sorry.
That's all right. I think the Zoom is resting. So now is this really, when you made your opening remarks, you were really highlighting that Barclays obviously has a broad footprint by region, but also across different sort of customer groups and so on. And I was wondering whether there is sort of maybe how you're thinking about this emerging market developing country dimension, and also sort of how you're starting to think about particular customer groups and how sort of net zero and transition.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Apologies for the so what, as you know, we're kind of like at the early kind of like journey in this space, and we're building kind of like the foundations for our work. But we're trying precisely to understand these two key issues. So what are the difference between the different areas where we kind of like operate, and then the different stakeholders, so the different clients and the different people that would be impacted. So on the one hand, so in terms of the geographical approach, one of the things we've been doing is working with Ceres in the US, which I don't know if people are familiar here with this organization that has been at the beginning or the foundation of Climate Action 100 in help us understand what is actually the perspective that the US is bringing to just transition. And I think it's an interesting question given kind of like the current controversy around ESG issues and sustainability issues in the US. And it's been very interesting for us to understand sort of the backward-looking kind of like perspective that the US is bringing to the aspect of just transition. So while here in Europe and in the conversations we're having here is more about looking to the future. So we are looking to transition out of certain sectors and transition into certain sectors, right, or certain activities. So how do we go about the transition, right? So it's a kind of like looking to the future. Somehow what we've learned, what we've seen is that in the US, there is also a component of what you would call more environmental climate justice. So it is already how financial institutions, for example, would contribute to kind of like mend or repair kind of like impacts that they have caused in the past with certain kind of like financial practices. And a lot of the work that is kind of like considered in the space of just transition is very much related to kind of like these past kind of like activities. So I think that's an interesting kind of like learning for us in how we go about this and what we think about that. And on the other aspect, Nick, that you mentioned about the different stakeholders. So we engaged very early on with the Fajita precisely to understand, the challenges and seek guidance on these. So very important part, on terms of the transition. But we have also joined a working group of the decarbonization of the mortgage portfolio, and that is I think a key element, trying to look collectively at addressing a very pressing issue at the moment, which is the human and social challenges of the housing transition, in particular in the context of the energy crisis. So this is an ongoing work that you're very, as always, very actively leading and putting together the major lenders in the UK. And I think that the last kind of like part that I can highlight of what we're trying to understand, in terms of these different stakeholders and geographies is with SMEs. So we're also part of the banking environment initiative at Cambridge University, and we're also looking at exploring how banks can support SMEs during the transition to net zero. So at the moment, this is kind of like the way we're trying really to understand these different elements to then translate those into, the different actions.
Great, thank you very much. Paddy, it'd be good to if there's more sort of granularity you want to give on some of the ways in which you're taking forward. I think you've mentioned both the policy engagement and the corporate engagement, the way you can use your influence. But there's also a question here, maybe you'd want to take it, which is also thinking about questions around equity and fairness and so on. And obviously, we've been talking largely about intra-generational equity, about sort of thinking about fairness within the current generation, but also intergenerational equity between us and future generations. But just if there's sort of another particular example you wanted to give, or if you wanted to address this intergenerational equity point.
Oh, thanks very much, Nick. And look, I think a lot of really good points have been made already. And I guess I also wanted to say, although we have been trying to do a lot, and it's great that Aviva is an example in the report, we certainly accept that we don't have all the answers at the moment. And I think almost by beginning from that basis and then trying to improve, that's the best way to actually get to a good outcome in terms of how any corporate is incorporating just transition within their climate action, including financial institutions like Aviva. I guess three things that I haven't gone into in quite as much detail before that might be worth flagging that we're encouraging peers and others to do is, so first of all, we explicitly have in our net zero plan, so we published our net zero plan in March this year, setting out how we wanted to be a net zero company by 2040 across all our key activities, so investment, underwriting, engagement, risk management. Within that, at the highest level, we've said that we have a target to align the entire plan to just transition principles. So it's fully baked in at the top. And that means that when we consider each element of that transition plan, we're trying to think, how can we look at it through a just transition lens? Now, some areas we're more advanced in than others, and actually it would have been brilliant to have your report with us while we were drafting our first transition plan, sort of 8 to 12 months ago. But certainly we will use it as a guide when we prepare the next version of our transition plan. I think we probably don't yet have it baked into every element of the transition plan in the way that you set out in the report, although I'd like to think that ultimately we will have it baked in throughout. A couple of examples that I haven't gone into before. So I've talked about the direct bilateral government and corporate engagement that we've done. So, just to add a little bit of flesh on the bone there, for the government engagement, we're essentially pushing the government to incorporate considerations of equity when they're making climate policy. And so that's, things like carbon pricing, distribution of revenue, that kind of thing. Probably self-evident to this audience, but sadly not incorporated by governments as much as it should be. The element that I haven't really talked about that actually makes the link to Tony and his work in GFANZ is we've sort of put our hands up to lead various pieces of work in GFANZ and in this thing called the UK Transition Plan Task Force, which is going to set mandatory guidance for transition plans for UK listed companies. And we've used that influence within those groups to push for the inclusion of just transition language. And that's not just in the framework for transition plans, which Tony's talked about in GFANZ. It's also in the mandatory framework and guidance that will be announced by the UK Transition Plan Task Force shortly. And it's in the call to action that GFANZ has issued to G20 governments. So, the phrase just transition is mentioned throughout that call to action, and we cite multiple individual examples. So I think there's something about integration and we're not all the way yet, but we're trying. And then there's something about engagement, not just bilateral engagement with corporates or governments, but looking at how you can leverage your influence within impactful groups. And then potentially, you know, we've all sort of touched on regulation throughout, but I do think that regulation drives action. You know, I don't think we should be scared of regulation in this space where there's, you know, there are clear examples of market failure. And so having some of that kind of this stuff baked into regulatory guidance, I think really does have an impact and will help bring up the level of everyone.
Great, Paddy. I think you've also started sort of pointing towards some of the things which are coming along next, and we're coming towards the end of our hour together. One of the questions that actually has got the most sort of votes is one from James Vaccaro, who's the Executive Director of the Climate Safe Lending Network. An interesting question. From the panel, any feedback on this one? What are the best examples of financial institutions inserting clauses into financial documents to steer just transition? Are there, for example, covenants for borrowing clients that invest in supporting workers and communities? Any feedback from that for anyone? Andrea, Brendan.
Well, I'd always encourage James to read the report because we have lots of examples in there. But if you had to ask for my favorite, and it speaks to a couple of different points that we've touched upon. So the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development launched a bond with Curran, which is a Polish energy utility, which not only helped them in their decarbonisation and produce new renewable capacity and link it in terms to the grid, but also thought about the social impacts of the closure of the coal plants there. Obviously, Poland and Lower Silesia has heavy reliance on coal for energy. And one aspect about that in terms of intergenerational impacts is they actually, I believe, and I'm sure colleagues from the EBRD are online will correct me about this after, they actually provided skills programs in the local universities so that the next generation had the set of skills to avail of the new green industries that were coming to the region. So that kind of holistic approach, but also providing kind of that development finance approach is probably what's needed to do some really interesting stuff in this space. So that's my favorite, Nick, I think, in terms of instrument.
So
yeah, Sharon, please.
So Nick, it's just on my mind because I'm going to be in Australia, my home country, in the next few weeks, and we have brought together trustees and an asset manager called IFM that focuses on infrastructure, and they have adopted a framework in major areas of investment as they've invested in ports or in airports or in, you know, heavy public related infrastructure, that they will have MOUs with the unions involved, that as the investor and the unions give the framework of kind of principles Brendan was talking about in that regard. And I must say, Paddy, I can only congratulate again Aviva, because just to have the ambition that all your plans will have just transition baked in, and to use, you know, the GFANT's work, and thank you very much, Tony, and I've said this to Mark, that just having that requirement for reporting and just transition, you know, disclosure is so important. But I wanted to leave you with a challenge for everybody. If we've had such a success in embedding informally, at least, a quasi-regulation accepted by many regulators in the TCFD space and the disclosure space around potential for not just exposure but stranded assets, can we do the same with a TCSD standard? Because then it would underpin the work that GFANTs, that others are trying to do, that investors need guidance around to push their corporates to actually disclose. That would de-risk some of the investments from a social front and potentially an economic front for them, but also help to push the transition. So just a challenge to leave with you.
And it's a fantastic one, particularly as we come to the end. So back to other people. Paddy, maybe just sort of some next steps from you, any particular things you're going to be leading on, and any thoughts on this idea of a sort of task force on social matters like the climate one.
So, I mean, immediate next steps, I've literally, not while we were talking, but just before we forwarded on the report to the UK task force. I think you've done the same, but to say we've got our framework coming out next week. It already has a hook. Actually, not next week, the week after next at COP. It already has a hook to talk about just transition in the guidance, including a number of reference points. And I'm very keen that this document goes in there so that as soon as that guidance goes live and firms actually begin to refer to it as they're making their transition plans, that yours will be, one of the key set texts to which they refer when they're making their transition plans. And similarly, I'm going to ask internal colleagues to take a look as we do our next revision of our own transition plan to see how we can use, the excellent research you've done here to begin to put the flesh on the bone. Because, Sharan, you've been very kind, but I almost feel you're too kind, right? It's great to have that aspiration and ambition, and we're proud of that. But if all it is an aspiration and ambition and the detail and the actions don't follow, then, I won't be proud of that. So, we're going to crack on and we're going to use this report to do so.
Thanks. So that's one thing that's coming down the line for people. The UK Transition Plan Task Force will be releasing its section neutral guidance very soon at COP. To you, Andrea, sort of next steps for you in terms of this agenda.
It's really to kind of like, we've been really doing, as I said, the foundation or the kind of like groundwork for us in terms of just transition, and it's really to continue our work on transition plans and with the guidance, because I think that at the moment, for financial institutions, it's kind of like trying to in a way, waiting somehow also for the guidance to make sure that we make the steps in the right direction. And I think this is where kind of like we find ourselves kind of like saying, okay, the guidance is already there. GFANS hopefully is going to come up, with also the kind of like steps during 2023. And then we kind of like move in a more kind of like solid grounds, right? And we're also kind of like looking at an opportunity to contribute to a specific kind of like project, kind of like in the making. And when it happens, we hopefully can make it public. But at the moment, it's kind of like really trying to ground this kind of like thinking and kind of like foundational work in real kind of like actions. So that would be what we want to do next.
Thank you so much, Andrea. And Tony, the next things in terms of how GFANS might be taking forward in terms of the work you're doing.
So we also have our financial institution net zero transition plan framework coming out. Just to reassure people on the call, and as Paddy has said, we have worked very closely with the UK Transition Plan Task Force. So it is not just aligned, but they converge, and you'll be able to see multiple similarities between the two and use both equally and interchangeably. So that's a critical component, and it has the just transition. We reference out to the work that the Grantham Institute and yourself have pulled together, that excellent piece of work. To Sharon's point, this is the starting point. This isn't the end point. So for us, it's not that we necessarily see ourselves developing an enormous amount of new technical knowledge, but it's about actually embedding that across the industry going forward, rather than just going, and here's a whole new set of recommendations and guidance that you have to learn. It's more about, okay, well, how does it work in practice? And then what can we learn from that to refine?
Yeah. And Brendan, your thoughts about the sort of the key things to take forward for you?
Yeah, I think kind of repeating what's been said, in the sense this is the first iteration, and our first iteration in terms of what best practice can look like. And I understand that financial institutions are going to have their first attempt, and I think it has to be an ever improving process. With that in mind, I think as we get more examples of best practice in terms of across each of the themes, not just from commitments at the foundation level, but also examples of capital allocation. I was able to give a few to James's question earlier. We can start to build up better ideas in terms of measurement and metrics, and start to really converge on what that looks like for financial institutions. And that will be the next challenge, is reaching that stage where we can give more granularity and certainty over what measuring progress and outcome looks like from a just transition point of view for these plans.
Thank you very much. I think, to take your phrase, Paddy, aspirational and just transition is one thing, but action is another, and that's where these plans really sort of have to be getting really serious. It's been fantastic, actually, really hearing from your experiences. So thank you very much, Sharan. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Brendan. And also thank you to our colleagues, Alison Peacock and Aditya Subramani, who've been hosting this session. Thanks to all of you for joining. This video recording will be put on live, we'll put on the slides as well, and we look forward to engaging with you on this issue as we go forward. So thanks again, and many thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.